In the New Living Translation, it is Job is found after Genesis. In the NIV chronological deal, it is after Genesis 11:9, right? So why is that? Well, it is because Job is set during the time of the patriarchs, right? And so in Genesis 11:9, and after that, 11:10, that's when you start the story of Abraham. So it is technically set at that time. The New Living Translation chronological Bible chronology, it puts it at the end of Genesis just because it says, okay, well, that whole time is the time of the patriarchs. And so we'll just put it after that so that we don't break up the book of Genesis right in the middle, right? Note that even though the book of Job is set in that time period, it is written considerably later, right? So the book of Job is probably written as late as about 600 BC, which would be during the time of the exile, right? And so it's set in the 1800s, but or around there. It's written, though, considerably later, probably around 600, or let me say as late as 600 BC at the time of the exile. Job falls under the category of wisdom literature in your Bible. That is literature that is meant to teach the reader to apply human reason or good common sense to one's life, right? And of course, since the Bible, it presents wisdom, well, of course, since it is the Bible, it presents wisdom from God, right? Loaded question. And listen, that's like I tell my students, you can't hurt my feelings. I have one feeling, and that's hunger. And as long as you don't withhold food, you know, you're not going to hurt God's feelings. So you can answer honestly. What is your least favorite thing about reading the book of Job? You all loved every minute of it.
Constant back and forth.
It's constant back and forth. It is depressing indeed. And it's repetitive, right? It repeats the same thing over and over and over again, right? Well, note that that is on purpose, and that is a hallmark of Hebrew poetry. It is there to, and just for the record, it is actually a hallmark of ancient poetry in general. At least in the Bible, when you read the Bible in the Old Testament, Hebrew poetry, English translators and everything, you know, they spend a lot of time on it because it's the Word of God, right? Well, if you read other like Babylonian poetry or Ugaritic poetry or something like that, like they don't try to smooth it out at all. Like it is just, it's fairly horrible to read it because it's the same. It just keeps going and it's the same wording and stuff right after it, one thing right after another, and it's very repetitive. But it's repetitive on purpose because it reinforces the arguments. So here in Job, you have 3 cycles of dialogues or arguments between Job and his 3 friends, right? You have an interlude at chapter 28 where you have a hymn to wisdom. And then suddenly you got this guy named Elihu, and he just shows up out of nowhere. He's just suddenly there. And then we have arguments between Job and Elihu. And then we, of course, get to the speeches from God where he gets on Job a little bit. And then you have the prologue at the end. Of course, you have the prelude at the beginning where you have the deal with Satan and all of that, which we're going to talk a lot about that today. Okay. What is this all about? Well, much of it is about the retribution principle. The retribution principle, okay? The retribution principle says that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Right? And if you are suffering bad things, then you have done something bad. The gods are mad at you. And so therefore you need to repent of your sins, get right with God or the gods, and then they will bless you again. Right? We have several ancient Near Eastern parallels that, that led us in on this belief system. One is in Sumerian. It's called The Man and His God. It's from about 2000 BC, so this is written considerably before Job. And it is a monologue from a man who is suffering, right? So it's just his speech. He's just giving a speech by himself about his suffering. And he, of course, doesn't understand why he's suffering. In the end, though, he is shown his sin, so he doesn't know why. And he's like, well, I haven't sinned. And then he realizes that he did indeed sin. And so you get to the end, and there's no such thing as undeserved suffering. If you're suffering, it is deserved. You've done something wrong. Akkadian is the earliest Semitic language. So Hebrew is a Semitic language. Ugaritic is a Semitic language. Akkadian is the earliest Semitic language, right? It's related to Hebrew. It was spoken in Sumer and Babylon early on. And there's a Akkadian story called I Will Praise the Lord of Wisdom. So this is from about 1200 BC. And again, you have a man who is suffering and he doesn't know why. And Marduk, who is the head of the Babylonian pantheon of the gods, he forgives his sins. Again, the point there is ultimately that everyone who is suffering due to sin. Last, you have one that we'll deal with. You have one called the Babylonian Theodicy, or that's what we refer to it today. It's not like these are titled that way. This is from about 1000 BC, so considerably closer to Job. You have a dialogue between a sufferer and his friend, and they decide that the gods just simply can't be understood, right? And man is evil because the gods made them evil, and that's just the way it is, right? So, note that these myths in the ancient world show the gods as precarious, retaliatory, and fickle. Job's friends see God in the same way. They want him to confess to some unknown sins in order to placate God. It doesn't matter that he's actually innocent. They constantly accuse him of sinning. Like, you clearly, Job, you've done something wrong. And then they say, you're just prideful because you refuse to admit whatever sin it is that you've committed. So what's the point of the book of Job, or a major point? It is to counter that ancient Near Eastern belief. Job is described from the very beginning as righteous. We know that he's righteous. We know that he didn't do anything wrong, right? Everything about him is ideal, providing the perfect example of a righteous person. Okay, we know he is righteous, and we know that there is more going on than Job does, right? And so of course, he doesn't know what's going on. He's just like, he's like, my gosh, what have I done, And he says, I don't think I did anything. And then his friends are constantly, you did something, obviously, because you're suffering. Well, that's the wrong mindset, right? That's the wrong way to think. That's the way they thought. And the book of Job says you don't think that way. That's not the way God works. All right, so key ideas. It is not true that only the wicked suffer, right? We know today that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, right? We see it all the time. Of course, we know that there's ultimate justice, right? So whatever happens on this earth, righteousness will be rewarded, right? And unrighteousness will be punished. But on this earth, things happen both ways, and we can't know why. And that's ultimately the whole point of the book of Job, or one of the major points. God's justice cannot be reduced to a simple formula like the retribution principle. God's infinite wisdom is the key to acknowledging his justice. If God is infinitely wise, then we can have faith that he is also infinitely just, right? So we can't necessarily prove his justice because we look at the world and we say, well, things seem to be bad at times. But we can prove his wisdom. And if we can prove his wisdom, then we can assume that a wise God is a just God. One scholar puts it this way. He says, the purpose of the book of Job is to test God's policies concerning justice. The conclusion is God's justice cannot be assessed because we can never have enough information to do so. Instead, his justice must be inferred from his wisdom. We don't have enough information. It's like when we talk about it, sometimes we have to be careful, when somebody passes away or something, oftentimes we say things like, well, God just took little Johnny up to heaven because he needed him or stuff like that. That's not really how that works, right? But God does use bad things that happen for good. And so we can say, this terrible situation that you're in, you can't know what the ultimate ramifications of that may be in the future, right? It may have some ultimate benefit in the future that we may never see, but it still happens anyway. And so that's what you have to have faith in with God, is that he works these things out. Like, he knows, he's wise, and so therefore everything that happens is just in some way according to God's wisdom. Okay. We're going to talk about something called the Divine Assembly or the Divine Council, and we're going to talk a lot about Satan. And it's going to be in ways that you probably have not thought of before or heard before. Why are we going to do that? Like, why are we going to spend all this time talking about things that, you might, I don't think you'll find it interesting actually, but, well, it's because the ideas will keep coming up throughout the Old Testament. And oftentimes, they are related to things that you look at and you think, that's just weird, right? If you don't look at Job and see God and Satan making a bet about Job and think, that's weird, like that's a little weird, then I don't know. I mean, I look at it and I think, well, that's odd, right? I think that's odd. We're going to get a little closer to understanding why that all is. You need to be able to recognize what's going on as you continue your readings. And as these things pop back up, you're going to have at least a better idea of what's going on. Okay, so the Divine Assembly or the Divine Council of God. What is that all about? Well, at Job 1:6, right? So if you go to Job 1:6, you can go right there at the beginning of Job. It says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And then if you skip to Job 2:1, it says, again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord, right? So you have the sons of God and you have Satan, and they're coming to present themselves before the Lord. Notice, as we said before, that in the Old Testament, sons of God usually, if not always, refers to angels, right? It certainly does here. It's certainly talking about divine beings here. So this is a divine council or a divine assembly. I'm just going to refer to it as a divine council from this point on. It is a divine council or divine assembly meeting. The divine council is a council of God's created beings in the divine realm, angels, if you will, right? Just as God uses humans, his created beings on earth, to do his will, he also uses divine beings that he created in the divine realm to do his will. It's the same difference. It's the same thing. And we see it. We get hints of it when, you have angels come down on earth and they send messages or whatever. But there's more to it than that. So you say, okay, well, where is there other evidence of a divine council? Like you're saying, well, I don't know. It just seems like a bunch of angels are there and I don't know what they're about, but I don't know that there's a meeting going on, right? Well, Psalm 82:1, if you want to look at Psalm 82, which is interesting because some of your translations may be a little different. But at Psalm 82:1-4, it says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So now, what's going on there? First of all, it says that God holds his place in the divine council, and then it says, in the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. What is that all about? Some of you may have a different translation. It may say that in the midst of mankind, or something like that. Some of the older translations will have that. The reason that is because they were uncomfortable with having God as among other gods. And so they're like, well, it can't be other gods because there aren't other gods. So it must be referring to man as gods, right? Well, that's not what it says, okay? And there is a better explanation. So the Hebrew is that Elohim has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the Elohim, he holds his judgment. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you'll remember from before, I told you that sometimes Yahweh is referred to Elohim, which is a plural word, a plural noun, that means gods, plural. but God is referred to in the plural as Elohim. But it's also used to refer to other gods, but it's also used to refer to other divine beings. Okay, so what we have here is we have God, like Yahweh, and he is there over a council of other divine beings. That's the point. And again, these are created beings in the divine world. Again, if you will, angels. I just generally say divine beings because there is clearly evidence in the Bible that there's other divine beings that, you know, show up in different places in Revelation, and which is obviously symbolic in different places, but there seems to be potentially an assortment of divine beings, so I just choose divine beings. Note, these divine beings are created by God. There's no equal divine beings or anything like that. They're all created by God. It says, how long will you judge unjustly at 82:2? How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. So this language is also the reason that some older translations would put mankind, because they would say, well, wait a minute. What would these divine beings have to do with all of these social issues, right? And I'm not going to go into all that, but if you look at Daniel 10, you have this idea, and there's other places where you have this idea, here included, you have this idea where God placed divine beings over the different nations. And in some way, they're responsible for those nations. Again, I'm not going to go into all that, but that seems to be their mindset. Same thing when you get to the book of Revelation, and you have Jesus among the churches, and then it talks about the spirits of those churches. Again, it would seem to be that God is, or that the Revelation is talking about that there is an angel put over each of those churches in some way, right? And so that's just the way they understood it, and it doesn't go into a lot of depth as to how that's going or what all that means, and so I'm not going to go into it. But just understand that it's clearly talking about divine beings, and we're going to keep going, and you're going to see that, again, it continues that. Psalm 89, 5-7 says, let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. Right? So the assembly of the holy ones is God among the divine beings. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord, right? And Lord is capitalized so that it's his proper name, Yahweh. Who among the heavenly beings is like Yahweh, right? Because again, he is God over all of the other divine beings. A God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all who are around him. So again, you have this idea of God with a council of divine angels, or however you want to look at it, divine beings that are there. And you say, I don't know, that still seems weird to me. I've never heard this before. I need more evidence. Okay. So what would happen then at these divine council meetings? We don't know yet from anything we've looked at. And so you can say, well, okay, well, if you could present me with some evidence of a divine council meeting where they actually come up with some, plans, like we have meetings here, right, about how the church is going to, do different things and this and that and the other and whatever. So does God ever have a meeting like that? Yes, he does. At 1 Kings 22, 19-23, you have where Ahab, he needs to go into battle and stuff. And so he needs to, he wants good news, right? He's like, all right, I need to go into battle. I need somebody to tell me I'm going to win. And so what does he do? He calls his prophets that are not going to tell him the truth. They're scared of him. And so he calls in his prophets. And then they call him Micaiah. And he says, oh, you called Micaiah? I don't want to hear from him because he always tells me the truth. And he's going to say bad stuff, right? And that's just going to bring me down, right? Now that obviously is the Joe Turner paraphrase. But they don't want that. Or he doesn't want that, right? But Micaiah comes in and he does it anyway. And he says this at 1 Kings 22, 19-23. It says, and Micaiah said, therefore, hear the word of Yahweh. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. So note that you have this body of divine beings there with God. God asks these divine beings for suggestions on how to basically get rid of Ahab. One of the spirits, one of the divine beings, gives a suggestion, and God accepts that suggestion. He says, okay, you will do that. Who was sent to perform the task? The divine being, the spirit, right? But then the text says, back at 22:23, now therefore behold, Yahweh, again in your translation it says the Lord, all caps, Yahweh has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. So note that Yahweh asks for a volunteer. The volunteer comes up, has a plan. Yahweh sends the volunteer to do the plan. But then who does it say is ultimately responsible for doing it? Yahweh, right? God. It says that God is the one who does it. So whenever one of the divine beings performs a task, it is said that God is the one who did it. Remember this, because this is going to be important. So now we're going to talk about Satan. Just for the record, if you get nervous as we talk about this and you're like, I think Joe's crazy, Satan is still going to be bad at the end of this, okay? So I'm not about to change your theology. I'm like, hey, guess what? We're not going to do that. We're not going to, turn into Satanists or anything. Note that in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word that is translated as Satan is ha-satan, okay? Ha is the definite article that means the or the, right? Satan is Satan, and it means adversary, accuser, challenger, right? So ha-satan means the adversary. That is the literal translation. And just like we wouldn't put the definite article, the, in front of my name, we wouldn't say the Joseph, right? You wouldn't do it for a proper name in the Old Testament, okay? The Satan in the Old Testament is not a proper name, but a role. And it is a prosecutorial, accusatory, challenger role, right? And I'll go ahead and tell you, spoiler alert. So it begins to change throughout the intertestamental period to a proper name where they think of Satan as a proper name. And then the New Testament absolutely has the proper name Satan. So why do they not put the Satan in the Old Testament like it technically should be? Because nobody wants to be the first translator to change the Old Testament to say the adversary or something like that to be different. But Satan is portrayed in this prosecutorial role throughout the Old Testament. So now let's look at Job 1, 6 through 12. Let's pretend that you don't know anything about Satan or anything else, right? You just read this passage. Again, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The sons of God are angels, and Satan, the adversary, if you will, but I'm going to continue to say Satan, but note that it's the adversary. The adversary also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge of protection around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Right? Now, what is Satan's concern? Satan's concern is that if someone is constantly blessed by God, then how can we know that righteousness comes honestly, right? If this person is always happy and always says, hey, you're the one that, thanks God, my life is so great, then how can we know that their righteousness is honest? Looked at another way, will a righteous person stay so if blessings are withdrawn? Okay. Who initiates the conversation about Job? God does. Is Satan able to do anything without being allowed by God to do it? No. Is this conversation inherently contentious in any way? Do you feel like it's contentious? Are they arguing? Of course, because it's Satan, right? You're like, yeah, because no, not really. Not really, right? So then we get to the second meeting at 2:1-10. And it says, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So notice the wording changes ever so slightly, where it says that the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, which is what it said before. But it said Satan was also with him. But now it says, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So again, note that Satan always shows up, or the adversary always shows up when there's a divine council meeting, right? He's always there for a meeting. And people don't show up when there's a meeting if they're not invited, right? Because nobody wants to go to a meeting. I'm a nerd. I like meetings, but I'm obviously mentally unstable. All right. So it says, and the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. Who went out to do something originally to Job? Who went out? Satan did, right? But who does God say did it now? He said he did it. So again, remember from before when we talked about that 1 Kings passage, and we said whenever God allows a divine being to go out and do something, it is though God did it himself, and he takes the credit for that. Sounds familiar, right? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. So Satan, I'm just going fast because ultimately we just want to finish the conversation, but there's not really a lot that we're going to talk about here. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. So she's not very helpful, right? But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So note, Job gets it, right? He says, listen, things have gone well for me. I have faith in God. I'm righteous. When things go badly for me, I'm not going to turn on God. I'm still going to keep my righteousness. I'm still going to trust in God. That's what the lesson that we need to learn. That's pretty much it in a nutshell, what we're supposed to get out of this book. So again, we talked about all that, and we find that here we have God saying that what Satan did to Job, he did himself. He says as though Satan convinced him to do it, right? And listen, this is not a deal where Satan talked God into, he tricked him into hurting Job, right? I mean, surely we don't think that. again, let's look at, you don't have to turn to this because it's just one verse in each place. So if you want, just stay where you're at. And I'll just read it. 1 Chronicles 21:1. It says, then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel, right? Then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So this is when David goes out. He numbers Israel because he's got to go into battle. And it seems to be that it's a faith issue, right? So he numbers all of his troops and stuff to make sure that he can win the battle instead of just having faith in God that he can do this. God gets very upset about this and he's punished. So it says, then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. Note that this is, in the Old Testament, this is the only place where the word Satan does not have the definite article. So it is just the word Satan. And so there's a number of reasons potential for that. It is probably, or I won't say probably, it may be because 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles are written considerably later. And it may be that by that time, Satan has made the transition to having the proper name Satan and not just the adversary. But there are also linguistic reasons that it could still be the same thing, but they just took out the for whatever reason. But that doesn't really matter. Note also, just for the record, that the adversary, the Satan, is used also in the Old Testament to refer to humans who are adversaries, so human adversaries, and also the angel of the Lord. When you have the Balaam story, remember when you have Balaam and the talking donkey in Numbers, and it stops because the angel of the Lord is there with a sword? Well, it refers to the angel of the Lord, who is God, as the Ha-Satan, which is the adversary, because he is the adversary of Balaam at that time. So you get it used a lot of different ways, but we're talking about those times when it's clearly used of a divine being who has this office or whatever, however you want to describe it, where he has a specific job. So again, 1 Chronicles 21:1, then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. And then you go to 2 Samuel 24:1, which is the parallel verse, and it says, again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go number Israel and Judah. So in 2 Samuel, it says that God's the one who incited him to do it. But in 1 Chronicles 21:1, it says that Satan is the one who did it. So again, you have God taking credit, if you will, or taking responsibility. That's a better word. Taking the responsibility for the actions of Satan or the Satan, or however you want to look at it. Agents of God, right? You have agents of God, in this case, the accuser, performing tasks that are ascribed to Yahweh. Then you go to Zechariah 3, and you go to Zechariah 3. That's probably a good something to kind of look at. Zechariah 3:1-2. In this case, you have Zechariah, who is post-exilic, or there at the end of the exile, if you will. And he's having a vision. It's one of his night visions. And he sees Joshua, who is the high priest, or going to be the high priest, in this divine council meeting, right? He's there. But in this divine council meeting in Zechariah, it seems to be set up as a judiciary, or it is. It's definitely set up as a judiciary where he is on trial. It's a vision. So note that Joshua, he represents all of Israel as the high priest, or the potential high priest. He represents all of Israel. And Israel is coming out of the exile. And so Israel is absolutely guilty of sin, right? And so that's kind of the point. And that's why Joshua is on trial as the high priest, as the representative of Israel. He's on trial. So it says there, it says, then he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And just for the record, the word there is Ha-Satan, which is the adversary, standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire? So the point there is that the adversary, or Satan, he is accusing Joshua as guilty. He's saying, you are guilty. And he is absolutely right. They are absolutely, Israel is absolutely guilty. The reason that the Lord rebukes Satan here is because he has decided to extend his grace. And so therefore he rebukes him, not because he's wrong, but because he's going to extend grace. That's what it means. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire? A brand plucked from the fire is a stick that's burning, and you take it out of the fire and keep it from burning up, right? And so he is saving Israel and not giving them the further punishment that they still deserve. So interestingly, Satan has a role in the Old Testament. And an ancient Israelite with only the Hebrew Bible would not think of the Satan character here as inherently evil. There is nothing about any of that if you didn't have the information that we have today, given by progressive revelation, you would not have any of that. And I know some of you are thinking, well, what about this and what about that? We're going to do those right now. So then what about the serpent in Genesis 3 and Satan, right? Well, note that nothing in the Old Testament associates Satan or the adversary with the serpent of Genesis 3. At no point are those two associated in the Old Testament. Note that the serpent is described as one of the beasts of the field. It's not until the Intertestamental Period, which is between the Old Testament, that period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that we get Satan as a proper name associated with the serpent in Genesis 3. And the earliest association that we have between the two comes from a book called The Wisdom of Solomon, where it says in chapter 2, 23 through 24, obviously you don't have the Wisdom of Solomon in your Bible, unless by chance you have a Catholic Bible, and then you do have that. But it says this, it says, "For God created mankind for incorruption and made him in the image of his own character, but through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his party experience it." Okay, so you're like, well, wait a minute. The Wisdom of Solomon is not my Bible. Why are we talking about it? Because the Wisdom of Solomon gives us a window into the thoughts of people who lived, Jewish people who lived between the Old Testament and the New Testament period. You all right? You good?
Well, I'll do.
So it gives us a window into the thoughts of Jewish people during that time. Note that the devil here is associated with the serpent. The Greek word diablos, or devil, means adversary or slanderer, right? So it has the same meaning that the Old Testament ha-satan has. Revelation 12:9 associates the devil with Satan, where it says, "And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." So note, you have the dragon, the ancient serpent, devil, and Satan all in the same place, right? So you have them all associated together. And then Revelation 22 associates the devil with Satan also, and with the serpent, where it says, "And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Paul also makes the association with the serpent and Satan of Genesis 3:15 very specifically in Romans 16:20, where he says, "The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you." He is referring directly back to Genesis 3:15, which states, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So Paul is making that connection back. And specifically, he says that Satan, who again in the New Testament is a proper name, is the serpent of, or I will say is associated with the serpent of Genesis 3:15. So how are we to reconcile these two? Okay. Meaning the serpent was Satan. E.J. Young, who's a scholar of old, he says it this way, honestly, and he says it honestly. In the light of the plain statements of the New Testament, referring to John 8:44, Revelation 12:9, and 22, we have every right to say that Eve was tempted of the devil. The evil thoughts which issued from the mouth of an actual snake found their origin in the devil himself. In some sense that we cannot understand, for God has not revealed it unto us, the snake was an instrument used of the devil. To attempt to explain how the devil employed the snake is a task of which we are not capable, nor is it particularly profitable that we should know how this was done. That it was done, however, the data of the Bible compel us to believe. We are far from saying that Eve herself understood this when the words issued from the serpent's mouth. Even Moses, the writer of Genesis, may not have had the full knowledge of the subject that is possessed by New Testament believers, right? So again, when you look at the Old Testament and this concept of Satan, if you only had the Old Testament, you wouldn't get all of that. It's not until you get the whole idea of progressive revelation that we get a fuller concept from particularly the New Testament. Note that the idea of Satan as deceiver, right, one who specifically deceives, is also developed in the intertestamental period, so that period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Again, obviously these are books outside of the Bible, but they tell us how Jewish people thought. So we have two examples that I brought out. One is from a book called The Testament of Dan, which reads at 3:6. It says, "This spirit always moves with falsehood at the right hand of Satan, in order that such deeds may be done through savagery and deception." So again, you have Satan, associated with deception. And I have another verse from the Testament of Job at 3:3-6. And it ultimately says the same thing. It says that Satan deceives, and it talks about that, right? So you have that whole idea of Satan as deceiver. Again, throughout the intertestamental period and the New Testament. So your other question, but wait a minute. I know somewhere in the Old Testament, I remember reading that Satan fell. I remember that story. I'm not going to tell you where this is because I don't want you to look it up. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Who is Lucifer?
God's highest archangel.
Satan, right? Satan. Okay. Note, your mind's about to be blown. Lucifer is the Latin word that means light bringer. In the 300s, you had a guy named Jerome in the Catholic Church, and he translated the Bible into Latin. We call that Bible the Latin Vulgate, right? It's the Bible that the Catholic Church still, when they read from Latin, it's from the Latin Vulgate. When the King James translators, I'll go ahead and let you go to it. It is Isaiah 14:12-14 is where we were. Sorry, I saw you flipping. I forgot that I didn't say. When the King James but listen, please listen though. Don't look at that yet. Listen. When the King James translators translated into English, they didn't have as many texts as we have today. So they used the Latin Vulgate as one of their texts that they translated into English. That is a problem because the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and Aramaic. Then it was translated by Jerome into Latin. That's not a problem. That's good. They translated into Latin. But then for the King James translators to then translate from Latin into English, that presented problems. You always want to go back to the original language if at all possible. They didn't do anything wrong. They just didn't have as many texts. And so therefore they used everything they had, right? The Latin word Lucifer means light bringer and refers to Venus, the morning star. when the King James translators translated the Old Testament, instead of translating the word Lucifer as light bringer or morning star, they made it a proper name. It is not meant to be a proper name. It is meant to mean day star or morning star. That's the correct translation. And you say, again, because we have this concept of Lucifer, right? This is the only place in the Bible where Lucifer is there as a proper name. And most of the reason I said not to look is because most of your translations would not have that. Unless you have a New King James Version or a King James Version or something older. Maybe an American Standard Version from like 1900. You don't have that translation, right? And you say, well, why? And how do we know that that didn't still refer to Satan, right, in some way? Well, context. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Isaiah 14, 3 through 4. Or 3. Isaiah 14, 3. Will anybody be honest and tell me that you still question that and you think, I think Lucifer's Satan? Anybody? Dang. Just for the record, you aren't going to hurt my feelings if you disagree. All right, but you will know it here in a minute. All right, so let's start reading at Isaiah 14, 3. When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt against who? The king of Babylon. How the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. Who struck the people in wrath and unceasing blows and persecuted the nations? The king of Babylon, right? The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypresses rejoice at you, the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us. So they would go up north to Lebanon. They would cut down trees. They would float them down the river, and then they would use them to make stuff, right? Or however they did that. But that's the cedars of Lebanon. Who was it that used to cut down the cedars of Lebanon and can't do it anymore because he's dead? Who's that? King of Babylon? Yes? Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. Who is the king that's going to be dead? Nobody wants to answer? The king of Babylon, right? Just for the record, the answer is always going to be the king of Babylon. I wouldn't do this if I was going to end up wait a minute. No, I was wrong. I made sure. All of them will answer you and say, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, the sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. Who did that? Who's going to go down to Sheol with everybody else? Notice that means he's going to be dead, right? So it's the king of Babylon.
King of Babylon.
So now we're at 14:12 through 14 with the correct translation. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. Who laid the nations low? The king of Babylon. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Who wanted to make themselves like the Most High? King of Babylon. It's about the king of Babylon's pride. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the pride of the king of Babylon. The rest is the same, and clearly the text is referring to the pride of the king of Babylon. I will go ahead and tell you, and we're not going to read it, but Ezekiel 28:11 through 19 presents a similar form, but in the form of a lament that describes the king of Tyre. And it specifically says, take up this lament against the king of Tyre. As one who was given great responsibility by God as a leader of a major city, but used it for evil, right? Then where's the fall of Satan? And when does it happen, right? So that's your next question.
King of Babylon.
The king, yes. Good answer.
Is that going to be?
That is not, just for the record, that answer is now ceased. The book of Revelation says that Satan loses access to heaven at the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. Chapter 12, 1 through 6, tell the story of the birth, death, and resurrection of the Messiah. And then verses 7 through 17 make clear that Satan is thrown down after the crucifixion and resurrection. Revelation 12, 10 through 12 is where we are now. Revelation 12, 10 through 12. It says, "And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." So again, you have that accusatory, prosecutorial style role. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, because they cannot be accused of sin anymore, because God or Jesus has covered their sins with his blood. That's the point here. "And by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil," again, Satan, serpent, all of that, "has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." So Satan is cast down and loses access to heaven, where he is then presented as lashing out at the church. The point there, and we're not going to get into it, the point there is, hey, church, in Revelation, in the first century, you are suffering persecution. Why are you suffering persecution? Not because Satan has won, but because he's losing. And now he's just lashing out in wrath. That's the reason things are so bad right now. Not because Satan is winning, but because he's losing and he's just mad, like throwing a temper tantrum. So what can we say about Satan in the Bible? Satan is progressively revealed through the Bible and Jewish people. Listen, it's the same thing with heaven, hell. There's so many theological things that aren't in the Old Testament. It doesn't mean that they're not there and that they're not true or whatever. It's that they're just not revealed in the Old Testament. It's just not the focus, right? You don't get those things until the New Testament. And that's okay. In the Old Testament, Satan is presented in a prosecutorial role in the divine counsel of God. In the Intertestamental Period, Satan begins being used as a proper name and is associated with the devil and the serpent of Genesis 3. The New Testament presents Satan as the devil, associates him with the serpent, and condemns him for tempting, deceiving, and accusing God's people. His access to heaven is lost at Revelation 12, but the actual original fall, or whatever that looks like, or whatever the original impetus was that whatever brouhaha, if you will, caused this break, or what, we just don't have that story in the Bible. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Clearly there's some issues, right? But we just don't have that. And so, again, we are generally informed by that Isaiah passage and the Ezekiel passage. That's pretty well filled out if you assume that that's talking about Satan. And in the Ezekiel passage, it doesn't say anything about Satan. It's just the Lord Lucifer or anything else. It's just the language. People say, well, that's too high a language to be talking about anybody other than Satan. And then they say, well, it sounds like that Isaiah 14, 12 through 14 passage. And since that says Lucifer, and since we know that Lucifer is Satan, then it just all comes together. But that's all based on a false premise. That passage in Isaiah has nothing to do with Satan. And there are still people today who will argue and say, no, I don't know. I feel like it just does. I mean, you can feel like that, but the text clearly does not support that. And we obviously want to go with what the text says. A lot of times this divine counsel stuff, right? People will look at that. And don't get me wrong, some of it will go too far. And there's a whole, what's called the divine counsel worldview. And I will say my Hebrew professor for third semester Hebrew, who, just for the record, keep his family in your prayers. He's actually about to die from cancer. He's stopped treatment. His name's Mike Heiser, and he writes a lot about the divine counsel and all of that. He's a Bible scholar, and it's important scholarship. It's kind of revolutionary stuff. But this aspect, the things that, like, I'm never going to say anything in here that's just like some far out, far-fetched thing that nobody really believes, I would never do that, right? And so this is known stuff. Like it's just known. And I've explained it to you, hopefully in a fairly easy way to understand, but you see it with your own eyes. I'm not making this stuff up. It's clearly there. And if we were to take the Bible seriously for what it says and interpret it, the way they would have interpreted it, which is my job, right? My job here, as I've given my job, is to help you to understand the Bible like an ancient person, like an ancient Israelite or an ancient Jewish person. And that's the way they would have understood all of this. They would have seen all of this that way. And that's just the way it is. And we have to look at it that way. And that will help you, again, as you go along, it'll help you to understand passages and you'll say, oh, this is what they're thinking, and it will make sense. When we get to Daniel, we'll talk more about that whole nation stuff and all of that because it's pretty interesting. Look at Daniel 10 and see if that doesn't confuse you. All right, so listen, next week, we're at least going to talk about Sheol. We're going to talk about Leviathan and Behemoth. I will, spoiler alert, and maybe to get you ready to argue with me next week, Behemoth and Leviathan are not dinosaurs, unless you know of a dinosaur that has multiple heads. So we'll look at that stuff and have some fun. We'll look at Sheol and how kind of the concept of the underworld and the grave and things like that. We'll talk about that. And then I'll be honest with you, I don't know if we'll go into Exodus, or if I might try to hold Exodus off until the next week so we don't split between two lessons. But it depends on how much of this I get. It may be that I need to go into Exodus just for time. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.